You are listening to Radiant Creators, a collaborative project composed of people whose passion, purpose, and dedication requires forging their own unique path of empowerment and livelihood. A Radiant Creator isn't making a living, they are living.
Welcome home, Radiant Creators. Today we are talking with Niles Heckman, a documentarian whose work focuses around the themes of naturalism, occultism, and esotericism. He is the director of the feature film Transmutation, the documentary series Shamans of the Global Village, and a series of short-form documentary narrations. He shares insights in his films, writings, podcasts, mentorships with others, alternate media appearances, and his photography blog, Philosophical Photography, all of which are produced independently and can be found at nilesheckman.com. This interview just started right out rocking from the start. It was great. We covered a lot of ground, such as the evolving personal bio, street photography and capturing the sweetness of life. There is a difference between knowing the path and walking the path, as Morpheus says, and finding the yellow brick road of authentic life. When people have a bio, it is so tremendously helpful.
Yes, and some bios are very long. I've been to people's websites where they have these bios that are about as long as the U.S. Constitution, and it's always nice to just shorten your bio to short and sweet. And this is the thing about a bio, too, is that sometimes as we develop and change, our bio should always be in flux and changing, right? So I find myself constantly micro-tweaking my bio on an annual basis.
I think that's important. It should really be a living document, as they call it in the corporate world.
Yeah, and you should look at your progress and track progress through the episodes that you do and see that you've gotten better at them, and then know that the bio is changing and be like, oh, that bio is not accurate. I can reword that better, and I can simplify that, or just kind of delineate that in a more streamlined way so that it relays the information more effectively. So that's why when I do see people with very long bios that are listing every single accomplishment, it's kind of Snorville. And that's why it's really important in our just general communication to relay less with more information. And there's a huge power to that and a huge level of development to that when somebody can say a lot with a few words.
Yeah, because when the bio is talking about, and when I was a Boy Scout,
right,
yeah,
information that's not really relevant to anything specific, or just very vague stuff, or kind of these minutia award references and stuff like that. And I look back to it, tracking past progress, where you always end up listing, like you mentioned in the corporate world, as you're much less of a creative and sovereign and individualistic person, you associate so much of your background with just your thing that you're a part of in terms of a job or a career, right? So much of your bio is just about your work or job accomplishments, and it has little to nothing to do with your actual life accomplishments or what you've created on your own. And it's good to see a bio evolve over time where that changes from just what might be some standard operating resume into something that's much more of you are a creative person that's doing it in a very novel way and has a lot of unique works that outwardly manifest from that creativity and originality. And that is resident in your bio through the things that you've actually created, which are your own unique works.
It's kind of like with programmers, so people who do computer programming. I knew a super talented programmer once, and he said that if it's well enough written, it's a story in itself. You don't need to document it. It tells you what it's doing. So in a sense, I think that integration between bio and the content you're creating, if you're doing lots of interviews and people are checking you out and they see that you have a bio, they can go, yes, I can cut and paste that. Boom. We'll interview them.
That's so true. Two things so true about that. One is I know exactly what you're talking about with code, having a very technical past background as well, where you can look at somebody's work on some sort of screen in some sort of very technical medium and be like, yes, they are you can see a lot about them by what their code is doing. And you can see that they're very organized and they have a very structured mind in a very, Virgo specific way about data and cleanliness and stuff like that. And I used to work in this industry, dude, where you would basically run shots in what's essentially, it's called pushing shots through a pipeline in a Hollywood production. And you do these in scripts where you'd have this node-based script and you'd be outputting a shot. And this is all like kind of visual effects, digital stuff. But you could tell by the quality of the output based upon what the node graph in the script was doing. So it's very much like how Matrix code worked, right? Where like Neo could eventually look at the code and just start reading the code. He could kind of flip the circuit board over and see only the code and then know how to interpret that, right? And there was that character in the Matrix that said, I don't even see the code. I just see like blonde, brunette, redhead. So that's definitely a way to interpret things. As you get better at your field too, you have you have that kind of vision and that capability.
Yeah, when I was doing more programming for a good number of years, I took pride in the perfection of mundane things, you might say.
Yeah, it's the same with editors and musicians. When you look at if you're doing something in sort of a digital music medium and you look at the Adobe Audition project file and you see all these layers and all these different nested sequences and things and how those are laid out and put together in a very clean way generally helps streamline the process. And anything that's streamlined just helps make it more simplistic so that you can focus on just the art and the craft and not get bogged down in technical minutia. So again, with a lot of these technical things that result in an output, whether it's code or some sort of editing suite, when you have a good workflow, it really does help your process. And that's kind of like life, right? Where if you clean out your life and just clean out your house, you have to have a nice kind of clean starting point in terms of this Zen framework on how you live your life, so that you have all this like extra dust and clutter out, which is kind of like the opposite of what a hoarder is, right? Where it's like a hoarder has such a cluttered mind that their house is just a cluttered mess. So if you streamline and really clean out and simplify, it really helps you in processes, especially creative processes, at least I've found.
A secret language to it, like anything you're good at, you can almost use as an oracle to read from. I notice in editing the audio for these recordings and other things that I do, when you're looking at that audio, I think it's called a sine wave, the audio wave, when you're looking at the voices and such, you can actually tell a lot about a person's personality. You can see how sure of themselves they are, how concise they are. You can tell if they're being honest. It's funny. You could almost, just like there's palm readers.
Yes.
You could literally just say, okay, record some of your voice, and then I'm going to, look at it, and I could tell a lot about a person just from their sine wave, from that signature of their voice when it's recorded.
Yeah, you're talking about the waveform of the
waveform.
audio.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like Charlie Brown's T-shirt or something, right? Where you can just look at it and it's a language in itself, and you can see the peaks and the valleys. And when you get good enough at editing audio, even though this is kind of a technical thing, it's very true, dude, that like you learn how to read the waveform more than just listen to it. And this is the same way with how some animators work that I've worked with in the past in my, again, former career, is they just look at the graphs. They wouldn't even look at the character animation. They'd just be able to see what the arm was doing and the head turn was doing at that moment just by looking at how the graphs are laid out, right? So you kind of see behind the curtain through your craft as you're good at things technically. And it's funny you do say that, dude, because as somebody that's edited a frequent amount of audio as well, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I've also, as somebody that's had products that are sold through a medium such as the internet as kind of an independent content creator, you see how untechnical some people are to the point where they struggle with the base things with technical aspects. So as we have our creative ventures and do things that are both analog and digital, it's nice to be good at both here and there, but being just completely inept at one or the other is not necessarily good. It's good to be good at things technically and be good at things in the real world as well.
That line that is never fully completed, jack of all trades, master of none, that's what you hear, and it tends to be a put down, but the whole saying I found one day was actually jack of all trades, master of none, often better than a master of one.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes, I didn't know. I was shocked, and I'm like, yeah,
wow,
yeah. And there's sort of a dedication to the bigger picture of your mission, because people have to take responsibility if they're serious to be good at every aspect of what they're doing. If you can't edit your audio or your video, then you're not taking your mission seriously enough, I think.
It's totally the way, dude, that I think every human being is capable of so much. And I honestly think that to say that certain people are artistic or musical or creative is false. I think so many people, if not every single person, unless you have some sort of severe challenges coming in, let's say you're born with some sort of learning disability or something that is to the point where you're very slow or you have physical ailments that keep you from doing these things. But basically, anybody is capable of creating excellence. And if you look at somebody like Leonardo da Vinci or people like that in the past that were these multifaceted geniuses, they got really good at multiple things, right? They got really good at half a dozen things, and then they got good at a dozen things, and then were exquisite at half a dozen things. And everybody, I think, should be like that. And that's a problem with suppression systems of today, as we're kept in low resonance as, these beautiful divine sovereign beings, is that we're compartmentalized into these very assembly line based things that reduce our higher capabilities of those multifaceted skill sets, right? So everybody is capable of doing multiple things and checking multiple boxes and being kind of a savant creative. And I think that's why you have seen that dynamic where a generalist is sometimes looked down on. It's looked as like a negative term because massive machine, whatever area of machine that may be, whether it's something from, a more governmental standpoint or a more corporation-based standpoint, it's all kind of the same dynamic. It's likely that they want to compartmentalize you and put you in some sort of thing that doesn't fully utilize your full capabilities.
If a person is working in the corporate world, whether it's like IT, I was in IT for like 25 years, or many other fields, oftentimes the machine that wants to hire you, they ask, well, do you already know how to do what we need done? And oftentimes I think to myself, well, if you're working in IT and you're not learning something new constantly, I'm not exactly sure what your job is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's nice to even have a position like that is a very in-demand technical position that kind of is one of those things like a systems administrator where it will always be needed and always exist because there's always going to be, as long as the EMPs don't wipe out everything or we have some sort of massive reboot, there's always going to be those needs for those types of positions. And with a lot of the constant high turnover of Moore's law of things changing so often in technology, there's so much new stuff coming in all the time. So it is nice to be in a field where it's not stagnant and it's always moving and changing a little bit, even though say what you will about, that compartmentalized role within IT that is not necessarily fully fulfilling to the natural human being. But at the same time, it's good that within a branch of something that is a field like that, it gives you some variety to at least have new things to look into in that area of work.
Yeah, and it's very fulfilling right now in life to be using all that experience now to, use all that technology that does exist to not work for the man.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And that's the thing is like, that's the power of the democratization of technology. Anybody that's creating any sort of radiantly creating, we'll say like any sort of media, you have this amazing capability to do that on like a laptop. I mean, our laptops can do amazing things now that we couldn't have done 20 years ago. So it is exciting times. It's interesting, unique, exciting times. And even though there's many downsides to things, even from a digital standpoint and even an internet standpoint, it's really cool to be able to put something like this together just basically on your own as somebody that is a multifaceted person that can create a workflow and a process where you're essentially doing much of the process yourself. That's what I do like about certain aspects of, typically I very much like higher consciousness, like almost higher antiquity music, like somebody like Johann Sebastian Bach or something. But on the rare occasion that I listen to some sort of newer music today, that's some sort of like electronic music, which of course is many steps removed from that, I still appreciate that there's benefits in that type of technology where like one individual can create an entire album by themselves or something like that. Even if you are doing something with more traditional analog instruments, you still can play each instrument by yourself and then, through technology, essentially be the whole band if you wanted to do it that way. So there's new options available for all that now.
My first job, I guess you'd say, was recording. I was working in recording studios. And I look at what it used to take to record somebody's voice or record a band, etc. And now, really, I would say that a recording studio is pretty silly. I don't see a point to it. Why? But I truly don't need it. And you think about the expense and the effort and the power it took to just record an album. And it's great because in a way, when things were harder, people did more. I think now that it's easier, in a way, people also tend to do less. But at the same time, you need less to do more. It's kind of a paradox.
It is. It's funny you say that because for the last couple major film projects I've done, I have my same sound buddy that I use, this gentleman named Andrew Duncan, who's just a genius sound guy. And we were doing a project in LA, and he was basically living in this dude's garage, and that was also his sound studio. And the way that we did our sound recording was we have like a Japanese screen with basically a blanket thrown over it, and that's our makeshift recording studio, right? It's not like we're at Skywalker Sound or anything, but you can still get fabulous results if you know what you're doing, right? So from a technical standpoint, again, this technology has allowed anybody to create stuff. And the downside of that is that you end up seeing so much stuff created now that there's just a avalanche of minutia. But even though there is more stuff, it's nice that people that otherwise wouldn't have been able to get past the dark sorcery gatekeepers can now at least create things that would not otherwise have been able to be brought into manifestation if they needed to use a massive, Foley stage or sound recording studio or something like that because of the expenses in the past.
The Shamans of the Global Village. Episode 1 is done. And is episode 2 coming? And I also kind of want to ask a bit of I used to call them like an icebreaker question.
Sure.
There was the excretion of the toad, and that had, I believe, a lot of DMT in it, and it was definitely psychoactive. And when I was watching the video, I was thinking to myself, I want to do that, but it also, that does not look very pleasant. And I'm wondering, did you partake of the psychoactive party?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a little bit of backstory on it. So, yeah, as a documentary filmmaker, in 2015, a colleague of mine, a colleague of mine named Marak Razam is kind of an experiential journalist who does a lot of work with the kind of entheogenic and psychedelic community. And he's a dear buddy of mine. And he and I went off and had this kind of adventure, much like the adventure that you sometimes hear about through Dennis and Terrence McKenna called The Experiment at La Chuera, where they went down to the jungle in South America and essentially had this life transformative experience as they were in search for a chemical, because they were essentially ethnobotanist students and they ended up stumbling across all these mushrooms and stuff. So we kind of did our own version of this kind of psychedelic adventure, not from a standpoint of just being kind of airheads that were just looking to trip, but very much from a standpoint of Rack being somebody that I almost think of as like a combination of a journalist and an anthropologist. So he and our dear friend Dave and I drove down to Mexico to meet this group of people that we had kind of co-assembled to help us create the pilot episode of a documentary series, which is created 100% independently. We did it with a very small budget. It was just essentially us. And it was the concept behind the show is to basically highlight what's essentially the modern shamanic resurgence that's going on these days, which of course is never televised. So indigenous and cultures for millennia have used essentially entheogenic medicines, which are basically psychedelics, to heal, illuminate, and connect them to the web of life. And that's always been a very major staple of their cultures for millennia, right? And this is something that, as we come to find that so much of what religious systems are actually very much based in astrotheology and shamanism. So these shamanistic practices are very much a direct experiential practice to a direct connection to something that's higher, a divine higher place. So as somebody that I was interested in exploring this, and as a documentary filmmaker that's interested in kind of more themes of essentially naturalism and occultism and esotericism, this project appealed to me to help Rack to do. So he and I are essentially the co-creators of this project. So just much like the McKenna brothers, we went down to Mexico to the Sonoran Desert to essentially shoot this pilot episode of this documentary series, focusing around a specific practitioner that was working with this specific indigenous medicine that's in the Sonoran Desert toad. The toad has since then changed to another name called Bufo. It used to be called Bufo alvarius, but now it's called Bufo incilius, or I believe is the correct pronunciation. But long story short, we went down and we filmed this thing around the specific practitioner, and the concept for the show is that we'd shoot this pilot episode on spec with very little budget, and hopefully we'd be able to make an entire series out of it. And it was a very, very fantastic. We had an amazing time. It was very life transformative. And we shot the material, and the episode basically concludes in a ceremony that uses this toad's glands, this chemical, which is essentially arguably one of the most powerful entheogens on the planet, if not the most very, very powerful entheogen that has been discovered to date. And it contains 5-methoxy-N-dimethyltryptamine. There's multiple types of DMT, but 5-methoxy-N-dimethyltryptamine is very much a white light-based experience when you actually partake in the medicine, which is extracted from the toads through their glands and then, yes, smoked. So I'm not the world expert on this stuff, but I am a documentarian that's interested in this type of material because I see the benefits of what indigenous cultures have done and how they've lived in balance with harmony and in balance and harmony with Gaia and cosmos and nature. So I can appreciate that and respect that to the point that not being an anthropologist, but a documentarian that's interested in actually just documenting what happened, we went down there and shot this stuff, and some pretty crazy things happened. And that's reflected in the first pilot episode. And you'll see even in the final ceremony, which, as you said, mate, is very, very intense. It's not recreational, and it's very heavy duty. And to be honest, the episode has been very controversial. So there's some good things about that, and some not so good things about the controversy around it, because there's a lot of politics within the community of it. But all that being said, we learned a lot. And I think all of us got so much out of it that was very life transformative and changing. And to answer your question, yes, I did partake in the medicine after I had essentially shot this last scene of the show on this one location. So that's a whole 10,000 hour other story. But it was a 5-minute experience that was probably one of the single most life transformative experiences in my life. And it could definitely fractal out into like a 97-hour conversation. But the point of it is that I have found through my projects, which are my personal passion projects, that as you kind of synchronistically follow the path of things that interest you, and then you align with people who also are co-interested by these things, and then you actually create things from that, you get massive reward from that. So I've had multiple projects now, at least 2 major projects. I have kind of small brushstroke projects and large brushstroke projects, but 2 primary projects that have gotten across the checkered finish line so far have been extremely, extremely life-changing in them because of the areas that I'm interested in, mainly things related to what you might call spirituality or consciousness or occultism or esotericism, because these things are so life transformative and help lead you on a path of what higher capabilities humans are able to achieve.
Well, I'm glad that you also smoked the bufo, because it was something that we were wondering here when we watched the documentary. We're like, well, we don't see Niles in there. Like, did he do it or not?
Right.
We're very
curious. I'm usually behind the camera. Exactly.
Because I know if I was there and I had to see, for me, I'm the person who always goes first, always, and people always think, oh man, you're really courageous, like you're really brave. It's like, no, I'm cowardly. I don't want to see you guys like barfing and in convulsions, and like I'll go first, and you can be terrified by me. That works.
Yeah, and a big part of the show is to essentially, I don't want to just say raise awareness, but just help document what shamanic practitioners have always done. And the concept for the show is to essentially focus each episode around a specific practitioner with a specific medicine. And we haven't yet come to episode 2, mainly because of one word that is always the obstacle for every creative, which is money. We made the first episode on a very shoestring budget. And for the budget that we made it on, which is smaller than the catering budget of your average television show for one day, I think it's a spectacular result for the tiny, 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 minuscule amount of money that we made it for. And a lot of really magical things ended up happening through the journey, much of which are reflected in the first episode. So I would highly encourage people to watch it. And I don't think it's quite like anything you've seen, because there's multiple things in it that, at least at the time, were filmed that I don't think had ever been filmed before. And it's important to also highlight, like I was going to say about the show, that we're not just trying to raise awareness, but we're trying to communicate a respect for the indigenous cultures, even though we are technically, we had gotten some criticism from being like the white man coming in and, trying to, pretty standard operating criticism stuff of trying to somehow, co-opt indigenous cultures and whatnot. But shamanism is very much, has always belonged to everybody. Shamanism isn't only a part of South American cultures or things that you see rampant through everywhere that's south of the United States. It's also been around for millennia in Northern Europe and in Siberia and Russia. So these are very areas of very Nordic, Northern European heritage, right, where a lot of my ancestors come from. So ideally, we could do this show and travel the world and show off all cultures in the past that have had a legacy of shamanistic practice, much of which has been stomped out and had so much suppression through the eons of the blood and pillaging of empire. So there's a lot there that can be shared, and it could be a really powerful and dynamic show as we are hoping to just continue to make it independently. But at the rate we're going, hopefully we'll get one episode done more often than the band Tool makes an album.
I get it. Yeah, and the daily catering bill for a TV show is quite substantial, people who are listening, just in case you're not familiar. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, it's just important to highlight with respect and show that, there's so much to the proper container being done in a proper respect of the culture, and also that the students of people that have had a shamanistic kind of training through an apprentice system is very much how like a mystery tradition would behave, right? Where you've done it through the lineage of the elders, and you've done it with a proper respect for the medicine. And as so many Westerners, obviously our culture is so foobar, we could use a lot of benefit from these entheogenic medicines that you do have a lot of consciousness raising capabilities for us in a very short amount of time. So that's why you see a lot of stressed out, depressed people going down to the jungle to drink ayahuasca, for example. They feel the call to having these experiences, which can be very life transformative in a short amount of time. But there's a lot of issues at play with loss of species habitat and, over farming of the medicines in various areas. There's stuff with peyote, for example, where it takes so long to grow that there's such a small amount of resource for it that there's not that many people can be exposed to it. Just like habitat extinction, there's issues with the medicines as well. So there's all these things that we could open up with the show, and also have it from a spiritual perspective, which is rarely seen. You see stuff from Vice, for example. There's some stuff on Vice that has very psychedelic based shows, but it's very much in a container of looking at things from not necessarily a spiritual angle, and not necessarily seeing things it's more from like a hard hitting journalistic perspective. So there's a definite need for good, truly, I guess I want to say a show that highlights the magic and the enchantment of what ancient cultures have been able to experience. And there's a resurgence of an interest in that these days now. So that's kind of my long-winded way to talk about our kind of pitch for this show, that if people are interested, the first episode has been made.
It's important because right now, people oftentimes think about they want to be an environmentalist, or people are concerned about the environment. And I think that it tends to be a very narrow-minded view where, I think his name is Aldo Leopold, who wrote Sand County Almanac. He said his take on it was that you are the land. And when you walk into the land, if you see it as separate from yourself, then you're not getting it. And that's what you should strive to do. And so once you and a land are one, and you're not trying to save the land or the environment, but yourself, then you're beginning to get it. And then he thought that you were kind of use to the movement. And I think, to me, really, the shamans, that knowledge, that deep knowledge of our plant world, you could almost consider that like environmentalism, because when they're gone, the environment is gone. I've oftentimes had that feeling that, like, when the last shaman is gone, well, the environment's gone too.
Yeah, I mean, there's such an interest and a resurgence in many of these ancient philosophical systems, like whether or not it's something that, you could say what you will about something like Freemasonry or mysticism or Rosicrucianism or shamanism. All these things are basically direct connection sources where you have to do work to actually experience things. That is kind of very terrifying to the mainstream unreality signal of Joker spirals, right? That reduces beings that have so much higher capabilities than they think. And so when you have these direct experiences, and to be honest, it's like sometimes, I don't want to say that certain people can be lost in them, but if you have the development on yourself and then you actually have some of these experiences, it can open you up to becoming such even more of a naturalist than you maybe even initially were. So if you were interested in the environment and, species, deforestation and losing of their habitats, then shamanism is, of course, the direct connection of human beings' experience with the environment through the direct connection with plants, and not only plants, but animals as well. A lot of these things are animal-based medicines. So yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like almost environmentalism cubed in some ways when you talk about shamanism.
I use the term wake up. I know it's somewhat nebulous, but I look at it like in the Matrix, Neo's path. You're lucky that divine providence kind of notices you and then helps you wake up, and you pull that plug and you look around and go, oh my God, like this is the state of humanity. Oh, you find yourself with a fellowship, you're on the Nebuchadnezzar, you have your fellowship, and then hopefully you can get to that, you're on that initiate's path, and you can get to that point where you stop bullets, where you create reality the way you want it. And it seems like people are diving in very deep into the psychoactive, plant world, like ayahuasca and the Bufo, because they realized, like, oh crap, I woke up when I was 48, I woke up when I was 36, there isn't much time left, and I have to have that direct experience. And that leads me on to something I was thinking about along the lines of this interview is, so you had the perfect career, as many would imagine. It appeared to be prestigious. I mean, you're working in Hollywood special effects, and many would say, wow, he's making money, he's arrived. It didn't work. You had to go and start creating your own documentaries. If we tie that into the psychoactive experience that people have, for some reason I'm just thinking of the Matrix a lot tonight, where Morpheus says there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path, and people want to start walking it and experiencing it so they can get further, quicker. That seems to be an energy that I sense today with people who are doing the psychoactives.
Yeah, it's funny how you say stop bullets. I mean, that's very much, obviously so much of the Matrix is very Gnostic, but what that is kind of more of a reference to, I think, would be something like the adept magician, which you could argue is the most kind of advanced magician, which is something that human beings in their most, I almost want to say, this is kind of just me talking from my own personal level of development, but human beings and their advanced capabilities, what they are really capable of. There's a dynamic with like mystery traditions, to my understanding, which is like lesser mystery, greater mystery stuff, where in the lesser mystery is you essentially learn how to master things within yourself esoterically. And then that, again, outwardly can manifest within the elements of magic. So you have like earth, air, fire, water. So when you can master things internally, you can actually affect things externally, right? And that can actually be shown in things that pretty much will seem to look like real magic to somebody that is completely uninitiated to them. So that's kind of the reference to stopping bullets, right? But in terms of, so much of what magic is, you look at something like shamanism is basically when you have a shamanistic experience, it's something that very much is under the umbrella of magic. And through ritual, if it's done in a proper container, and it's not done without disrespect, yes, you can get very far in a very short period of time. And that's the power of something like that, which is very good because we don't have a lot of time for certain things that we need to do in terms of move. But at the same time, it takes a long time to really spiritually grow and evolve, right? And nobody can hurry in that process. It takes decades. So as you have some of these experiences that show you a lot very, very quickly, then it's up to you to walk the walk in your day-to-day life and actually do things that can show that some of these experiences that you had, you can get to on your own in very basic ways through certain forms of spiritual or magical practice day to day. And, of course, meditation is the obvious one, right? Where if you have specific practices that you're very keen on doing daily, it can have huge advantages to kind of getting you back to some of those places. And that's part of the kind of potential other 97-hour conversation I could have about this. But I hear you, man. It's like, it's all about having experiences and then also doing things in your life that show that those experiences were not just a fun vacation, that you actually took things back and got data transmission from them that have benefited your life and helped your life and allowed you to steer your life in a way that you're doing more authentic things with it. So I have found that too, dude, that by being somebody that has had a massive reboot of what you could call a successful career. And up until just a couple of years ago, I would still periodically do a freelance job or two. But as somebody that might in the future still find myself doing a for-hire job here and there, the ratio of how often I do that is very much less now. And I found that by forging a path of my own creative projects, there's been huge rewards in that. Of course, financially, it's not as rewarding, but there's other rewards that definitely balance that out in many ways.
You did a talk on your site, I believe it's an audio, on Neville.
Yes, yeah, Neville Goddard.
Yeah, Neville Goddard. And when you think about arranging reality to your liking, it seems to me that if we're going to be on the path, one of the things that is, I'll just call it the awakening path. Like Neo, at a certain point, you might say like his initiation started when he pulled the big plug out the back of his neck, or when it was pulled out. Not all the attachments are gone, not all those plugs into you, but this big one is gone, and you look around and you realize, oh God, this is a big mess. Like, this is real. I always kind of thought we were just a bunch of copper tops, and now I realize that we really are. So, when it comes to that stopping bullets, it's a really important part of the movie, I think. But what I like about Neville, and I was really amazed that you did a little talk about Neville, is that Neville Goddard, he doesn't seem to be very well known. Strangely, there's hardly any pictures of him. And he did the most amazing talks on, I'm not even trying to describe it. He definitely livens up the Bible quite a lot in an empowering way, that we are all individually Jesus, and that, we are I've always took it as we are the creators of our reality. So it seems like a lot of passion, at least for me, is put towards, you got to be free to be on the path, because if you're stuck doing the 40-hour work week, it takes too long. It seems like expedience is really important on the path. You have to get to that point where your life is really about just working on it. It's almost like 90% working on the path, 10% mundane stuff. How do you feel about that?
I think that everybody's life is a unique snowflake, but everybody's life also has a yellow brick road that you can follow that kind of actualizes what you might call your true will, right? So your true will is what you actually should be doing with your life. Makes you the best person that you possibly can be, and also adds to what they call the great work. So, of course, the con of the society is that it wants you to think that you're a commercial trader, which you are absolutely not. So if you are wasting time being a commercial trader because we all need to make fake money, it's understandable, right? Because we all have to balance that, and nobody wants to be in subsistence and struggle. But I have found through my experience that a really good way to do that is to somehow balance that. And however you balance that is fine, whatever gets you there. So even if it's something where you decide that you want to have a much more streamed down lifestyle, you want to move to a place that has a very, very cost-effective living scenario so you don't have to work as much, whether it's some area where you're living in like a tiny house and you get rid of 95% of your stuff, and you're off the treadmill of the grind of paying a mortgage, or you move to some country like in Southeast Asia that is very cost effective to live in, or you marry somebody that has money, or you have some great job that lets you work 3 days a week. That really is a sustainable long-term way to not just be in subsistence and struggle financially, where then you can restructure your life to follow that yellow brick road and, work on pursuing your true will. Right, which is not easy. That is a very, very difficult thing to do. And to actually make a living off your creative ventures, whatever it is that you're most passionate about, whether or not you want to be like a writer or a musician or whatnot, everybody wants to do more creative things. And everybody's at the same pain points now where they're stuck somewhere, or they think that they're stuck somewhere, and they don't think that they can move. But I honestly have come to really feel that the puzzle pieces in everybody's life are there for them to self-arrange and figure out the path through the maze to actualize that, right? And so I feel like in recent years, after creating these couple projects, I've had a daughter who's quite young, and so I'm at this period where we're doing things that we're shuffling our living situation, for example, and I've figured out a way to make my living situation essentially very sustainable in a very expensive area. Right. So because of that, I know that after I get through this period of the next year or two, as she gets older and we move to a new location, that I have more time to work on my occult practices and studies. Right. So you can shift your life around so that you cater more time to what you're passionate about, and can actually work on your various like magical practices or creative pursuits or your spiritual growth, et cetera. And that is crucial, because like you say, dude, so many people just let the hourglass pass week after week, just thinking they're a commercial trader, trading all their time for just fake dollar bills, right, as the Rastafarians say.
I get it, yeah.
That sucks that away from you, right? So there's definitely, that is a huge self-initiation for yourself to figure out how you can live more lightly and cost effectively so that you can cater your time towards those pursuits.
The yellow brick road it's hardly a concept that many people are entertaining. It's following your bliss. Like without that,
your bliss,
you've really got nothing. And then people might say, well, what is my bliss? And so even beginning that path is very difficult for people. It's one of the nice things about listening to Neville, the idea of you can create a reality for yourself that is functional, that allows you to connect to that yellow brick road. And there's an interesting channeled entity called Bashar who says, follow your excitement. If you just can relax and feel it, there's excitement somewhere that you can take that'll get you on that path. It's very challenging for for most people, especially if they've never taken a step on it yet.
The heart is definitely like a leader. It's kind of like your sonar beacon that shows you what you need to do. And so as our mind is what we think and our heart is what we feel, I almost have thought that the heart is a connection to the subconscious mind. So when we subconsciously are drawn to something and we don't quite know why, but it resonates with us, that's the kind of thing that's chirping or chiming at you to kind of move and do something, right? And any time that I have ignored something that I felt, it's come back around kind of synchronistically, and then you realize that it's been telling you something. It's kind of blipping at you to follow and to pursue, and it's not always what you think, right? So that is that path walking, is that as somebody that is by no means an expert on all of this and is very much just a student of life, I have actually done things in my life that I've seen results from that are definitely taking risks and leaping off ledges a bit. And there's always struggle. It's never easy. Life is everybody has their bags of crap that they carry around, and some people's are much larger than others. But as you clean out your bag of crap, you have more bandwidth to really pursue these things, and then you do get rewards out of them. So Neville is a great person to reference how not only is the heart a way to feel into things and to know reality by what you can feel, that the mind is so important in terms of what you want to end up doing and bringing into manifestation. And so many people, if you lost 99 out of 100 people on a boardwalk, like what they really wanted, they wouldn't be able to tell you really what they want. So to have clear, concise goals about what you want and very precise steps to get there without your own self-inflicted roadblocks or obstacles is there's a lot in Neville's material, some of which is from an area of spiritual practice from the kind of turn of the century that is a derivative of other earlier practices called New Thought. A lot of his kind of New Thought material, which is kind of like early pre-self-help material, even a lot of the kind of current self-help stuff we know is so diluted and degraded. But if you can just set goals and give yourself a period to structure things so that you can think and focus on something, almost meditate on your immediate goals, there's huge benefit in the structures and systems that he's talking about to help yourself get there, for sure.
As he put it, feeling from the end, feel as if the wish has been fulfilled. So it's taking that 5 minutes a day in the morning while you're drinking coffee or whenever it might happen to be, but some kind of a consistent practice of, without any more details than are comfortable. When you get too detailed, then back off a little bit, but it's feeling your life as you want it to be, as if it already was.
Totally. And a great reference for this is, a great metaphor for this is like, let's say you're single and you work at a company and you totally have the hots for somebody, a gal that you're working with, and you want to bring into manifestation that you want her to be like your life partner, and you're focused and thinking on that, and you're always mentally so in a headspace of like, I want this person to be my future loved one, right? And that's all that you're focusing on. That's a goal that can potentially block what you really want, because what you think you want may not be what you actually want, right? Like what you really want is a life partner that loves you and benefits you and helps you grow and is a perfect fit for you. And so, for example, the goal should be, I want that. I don't want this specific person, because next week, for all you know, some other person might come along that is 10 times better of a fit than the first person that you thought you wanted, right? So you need to almost set goals that don't restrict or restrain yourself in terms of what you want to help bring into manifestation through your mental focus and clarity and processes. So that's why we set obstacles for ourselves without really even realizing it.
It's really getting in touch with one's, I'll just call it higher self or soul, essence, you could say. A lot of different words for it, and people say it different ways. But as we get in touch with that, it really takes practice, trial and error, tuning, and then when you have the hots with the person across the hall, that just becomes you would just see that person and say, these are the things I like about that person, and I would like those traits in the person that I'm really looking for. It's always that you have to have enough of a layer of abstraction to let the universe create for you. Because you have to remember that person has free will. Also, that person has their desires and goals. And the thing about the heart being a good guide, it reminds me of course, one of your latest documentary, Transmutation with Neil Kramer. Time in nature, I believe personally, trains the heart center to feel. That might be a great way for people to help get on that yellow brick road, because I believe that the heart feels out a ways. And when we're in buildings, when we're in corporate environments, when we're around negative people, that shuts down and becomes very, very small. It's not feeling outside of your chest. But I believe that your heart center should be feeling 12, 15 feet. It should be feeling the whole forest around you.
Yeah, you're not when you're in a very urban environment or something that's not their natural environment. It's okay for small periods of time, but it's kind of like an animal at the zoo, right? So you're inherently limited physically and geographically. So you're not in your natural space, and you're not like, let's say you're not drinking proper water, or you're not like walking around and earthing your feet properly on the ground, and you're not eating the right foods, and you're not under the right lighting. All that stuff adds up, and you're under bad air and XYZ, right? So all that stuff has a layered effect, and there's layers of an onion to all that stuff. So all that can be degrading to you pursuing what is your natural way of doing things. So when we get out into nature, it really helps kind of clarify stuff. I think when we're trying to be at a crossroads in our life where we're figuring out what we want to do next, it's very helpful if you can go to like your cabin up by the lake and help you think. And that's a lot of the times why people end up going up to write in a place of isolation. It just helps delineate and clarify and prevent from distractions. But to dial back into something that you just also said, dude, I find is that it's really interesting to think about the kind of synchronicity machine of life, and like you say, the path of somebody that's trying to be a more awakened human. I oftentimes think about this kind of goes back to our technical part of the conversation of like what's computing all that synchronicity data, right? So like I said, when I have done things where I've been out in nature and I've been shooting projects instead of being under fluorescent lighting all day or behind a screen for significant amounts of time in a dark room, that I find that it's more creative and it leads me to interesting places. And that I feel like when we do set up our own self obstacles, it's like the universe does want us to figure it out on our own, because that's part of that process. But those obstacles kind of challenge that synchronistic path, right? So not like I'm able to speak on behalf of the universe, but you see things in your own personal life through your own experience that show you that this stuff has benefit to it. And I think so much of just getting out into a natural environment can help just kind of clarify that, like I was mentioning. It reduces the noise, and it's not easy to do because not everybody has access to that. But even if you can be a New Yorker that can get into Central Park for a good chunk of the day, whatever you can do will help you in that regard.
Yeah, you definitely have to work with the nature that you have. I mean, if you're lucky, you've got, I would call it, real nature that you can get out into, where you might get eaten by a mountain lion. That to me is
totally.
is real nature. If there's no chance of you being eaten by a mountain lion, that's not real nature. So, but still, if an individual goes out on a regular basis, some once a week, once a month, whatever they can do once a day, then I think it's really important to note the changes of the season, note what nature does, and that helps you actually really get back in touch with the planet, nature, the natural seasonal cycles, and really the cycles of your body and your life.
You see this from more pagan kind of spiritual areas, something like, Wiccan or Druidry, for example, right? Where you see that they understand the best church is nature, and that human beings, I sometimes say, are not designed to be going out to the Cheesecake Factory on Friday night. They're designed to be in magical or shamanic ritual, right? Around the stone dolmens, like uploading to the astral. So that's kind of what human beings are very much more designed to be doing. And that's a beautiful part of what we're capable of. And it's a good point that the more out in nature you are, the more kind of threatening it can be, but the more challenging and rewarding it can be as well. And that's part of the container of having a proper respect for a earth-based medicine is, are you doing it in the right place and you're doing it in the right time, and following those kind of solar cycles, which are much more annual or yearly, or even many long phases over decades or thousands of years is what solar cycles show us, or the more monthly, daily based moon cycles, right? Knowing what the solar and lunar calendar is doing and knowing when to do those practices based on the astrology of that. Super important as well.
And finding that path, the yellow brick road, like how you put it, I also think one of the ways that we find that path is taking time to notice the sweetness of life. Do you do street photography?
I do, yeah. I mean, as a documentary photographer and filmmaker, I've had a long history of doing both still and moving images, and street photography is one part of documentary photography that I have always found really appealing, which is funny because, of course, it's the complete polar opposite of being out in nature. I should be like a landscape photographer or something, but I find myself as often, or if not way more, in urban environments, and I like candid kind of cinematic photography, much like my personal directorial style is very much in this kind of street photography style. As much of my projects are kind of shot in a street photography style, I find that being a street photographer is the part of documentary photography that I like. I'm also really drawn to like photojournalism or war journalism, even though I haven't personally done that. But ultimately, that essentially means nothing because anybody is basically a documentary photographer, right? Anybody that snaps a picture on their phone of their child at the park is a documentary photographer. But I happen to do it in a very specific style in a specific way. And that kind of is a bleed through between my still work and my film work. So street photography is the kind of form of documentary photography that I'm most called to, and I really like the history and lineage of other street photographers. So I do have this kind of urban element, and then I have this kind of nature element, and it's almost like more of my stills are urban, and then more of my films are based in nature and naturalism.
The thing about street photography that's really fun is it's kind of a form of, like as Carlos Castaneda put it, stalking, and you're also hunting, and oftentimes you're trying to get away with something. You're trying to snap this picture without the person realizing it, I think, to really capture that moment. So I think that trying to get a hold of that yellow brick road, I think finding the sweetness of life, definitely, I think street photography is a great hobby. Go out and take your phone. Phone works very well because people don't notice those anymore. And go out there and try to capture really the sweetness of life however you see it, and then you begin to, since we both are familiar with Neil Kramer, like links in the show notes, like what is empire and things like that, and link to such things, because I'm sure some people might be a little lost. Neil Kramer talks about just witnessing. That really is your one of your great purposes to being here, is to just witness, to see. And it seems like street photography is a great way to just witness and really be enamored with and captivated by the sweetness of life that you can go out there and stalk and hunt and capture.
Yeah, it is. It's very much like a dynamic where if you're out in nature and you can kind of turn down your ability to be such a loudmouth and be more in tune with it. If you're like an indigenous person living in the forest, you have much more capability to be exposed to animals in various states and even arguably see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. So in an urban environment, I sometimes joke that if I could have a superhero power, it would be invisibility, because it would really help with my documentation, either as a still photographer or as a documentary filmmaker, because a lot of the times as a documentarian, you want to basically just capture something without even being seen, right? So you're kind of like this fly on the wall that wants to get something. And much of what I've shot in my projects, you'll have cutaways of a moment in time that's just something captured that isn't necessarily directed. It's just how it really happened. And then you're just there to try and capture it cinematically, right? So whether or not I'm doing that as a street photographer or as a documentary filmmaker, it's a nice ability to kind of turn off yourself and not be intrusive. And a lot of street photography is designed to be done with these small rangefinder cameras that have are very discreet and non-intrusive and don't have these big, beefy, bulky sports lenses and things. So I find that a lot of the times when I have a camera, whether or not I'm shooting video or still imagery, like if I'm on the street of Tokyo or something, I'll be kind of catering towards one or the other, but then footage for that project will end up in some future documentary project about empire or the degradation of society through urban expansion and the destruction of nature and the reducing of human beings to just their roles within their work cycle and the day-to-day lifestyle of the grind, right? So it is nice to track kind of urban things as well. And I've kind of drawn out a little bit of a niche within my photography where I have the link to my photography is philosophical photography is kind of the brand name that I use for it, where I also try and capture an image of something and then have something, I don't want to just say profound, but something deeper and more substantial to say about it. Right? Because so much of what we do as we develop is that you actually have to have something to say. And that's the problem with so much work is it's nothing to say. It's either visually stunning, but it may be substantively just thin. So I always try with everything I make, as I'm interested in these areas of what you could say is esotericism, which really just means the inside of things, that there's a level of development where if I snap a photo of somebody on the street, there's a reason why I was drawn to that person and what is the kind of underbelly philosophical reasoning behind why I took that photo. And I would caption that with the photo, right, as I do on the blog. So it'd be nice to, it's a whole other story about doing gallery shows and that type of stuff and the pretentiousness of the industry, just like all entertainment industries getting notice on your work. But to have like a gallery show where you have these images of various street photography that you've taken and then actually like these captions of why you took it, right? And the same thing with why I would photograph something for a past project or a future documentary project that was interesting and worthy of being seen at that point in that time, of something that was maybe trying to convey some sort of spiritually philosophic message.
I think one thing about being a street photographer and stalking and hunting and trying to be invisible and stealthy and regal, it's a great it's a great practice. And I think that something I like about it is it helps you train how you see. I think it helps you train to see the sweetness of life, train to see the deeper that is behind the mundane that you see every day.
It does, and humanity is such an interesting character, right? Because you see so much within nature, and you see so much within the decay of some rotting insides of a city area, right? So if you're in some seedy part of an urban area and you see despair, sometimes there's negative aspects to photographing homeless people, for example. But when I was up in Portland recently, which has a huge homeless problem, like so many cities do, it's like you see this despair, and if that's something that you document and has a profound moment, just like some part of war journalism might do, right, where you photograph a dead body or something, there's huge power in still images, and that's the aspect of photojournalism that I really like. I don't like stagey photography. I like just what's real, right? That's what being a documentary filmmaker and photographer is. It's like capturing real, authentic moments of power. And so that has a huge benefit in it to show you something about yourself, and then also, capture something in a way that hopefully conveys that well to others. So it checks multiple boxes on all fronts to be interested in these things, where it's also something that you, as any artist does, you should be able to do it maybe in a group dynamic, but also you almost find that your best work your muse comes through when you're alone, right? So I will occasionally go to like workshops where I'm taking street photography with other people, but some of my best stuff will be like I'm on the street with my wife, and I have traveled to Barcelona, and she goes off for 2 hours and does her thing, and I go off for 2 hours and do my thing and shoot street photography by myself in my own zone, right? So just like any artist that's behind the easel painting until 3 a.m. in the morning by themselves, right? You get in your own kind of zone, and that's when kind of your inspiration can really come through. And I've certainly experienced that too, dude. Like working on the projects that we've mentioned, staying up way late nights, as we talked about, trying to get out into nature and not just be cooped up. But of course, there's many nights where we find ourselves like cranking away on something at home. And I kind of get in the zone as well as a filmmaker, where I'm like editing long hours, cranking through something. As somebody that doesn't have a whole massive budget production team where I'm sitting over somebody that's also editing, I also find myself having to edit a lot of my own material, just like you have to edit this podcast. But you get good at those things, and that's what's also nice about being multifaceted, is that then you can do a lot of creative things on your own and be your own kind of more creative own enterprise. So huge power in that too.
Well, yeah, as we approach those things that, even if they might seem slight, like street photography, it starts to definitely help one find that yellow brick road, because whenever you do anything creative like that, it's really honoring yourself. It's honoring the world. It's saying that, I am a creative being, and I'm going to go and sneak around the corner, and I'm going to get a picture of this person when they walk by because their makeup is ridiculous,
Totally. And that's like what singles that out and interests you, and what fulfillment do you get out of doing that? And that was what happened in our third act of our feature film, Transmutation, is that we highlight these people doing things that kind of fuel their own spiritual practice, right? And so we have somebody that's doing a tea ceremony, and we have somebody that's sun gazing, and somebody that's, going to the botanical garden to watch the flowers grow. And if I was to do the same version of that myself, it would be like I'd be out shooting my street photography, right? Like what fuels your creative passions, which then helps you kind of align yourself with your true will, and which kind of then hopefully aligns yourself ever so slightly with doing the great work. And then it's like, you could say the same for you, dude. It's like, if you and I were to go capture something about you, like what is some of your specific creative practices that you do? That would be something that we'd film around your own personal story of following your own path and creating things that resonate with you, so that you can kind of have space to figure out what you want to do with your life and your spirit and how your kind of soul grows, right? It's like we have this growth through our own creative personal expansion, for sure. And that kind of can only be found within the self over time as we foster these unique practices within us through our various creative outlets.
For maybe somebody who's struggling with that, I'd say that I am sure if you don't judge yourself, just chill out, be at peace. There's something that excites you, and whatever it is, make it important. The pursuit of things that interest us, that excite us, that really is, that is essential on the, every step somehow is followed by a future step. But if you don't take that first step, you never get to the next one. It's about creating velocity. Any step in a direction will, if that really excites you, even if it only excites you a little bit, it will create a velocity in a direction.
It will. And that's what I honestly have kind of really resonates with the feeling of what human beings are here to do. They're here to do creative things and to actualize themselves. Actualize is kind of this like 70s life spring talk term, but I rather like it because it kind of shows that you're capable of always doing more. And if you're in a grind or you're in a routine, like we all are, I have periods of time as well where I struggle and I think things have stagnated and things are monotonous. And as so much of a system of reduction on human beings sucks out enchantment and makes it so that it's very repetitive and robotic and routine, there are ways, if you have these repetitive and robotic routines, to just try and shuffle your decks of like things that we talked about so that you can give yourself more time to then have areas to pursue your creative outlets. And it doesn't need to be a hurry, right? It's like, it's nice to have experiences that level you up and stair step you and move you forward, but then there'll be like a dry period for a while. But at the same time, you can always foster a little bit of way to make it so that you have an outlet to balance that ever so slightly, moving yourself forward. And this is something I seem to, almost every conversation I have, we bring up this subject of balance, which is kind of key to esotericism, is how do you balance your life so that you're depolarized enough from things that are negative, like any whatever side of any sort of polarization you're on. If you're too polarized, it's not going to work from you. You need to kind of depolarize yourself in all fronts to really be able to kind of level up to magic and mystery and get to places.
And depolarizing, there was an essay that you wrote.
I'm stoked that you've listened to so many of the essays, dude. That's great.
Yeah.
It's nice to hear people are listening.
Oh, yeah, they're enjoyable for sure.
Yeah, great.
A Childish Asleep Robots, going back to that one, you mentioned how it doesn't really matter what your politics are, it's still, you're looking up to authority. You're really not being powerful. So, we all tend to be a little bit more left or right or a mix of both. But still, either way, you're really disempowering yourself. There is no triumph of the individual because you're saying like, oh, please, great, government, God, would you please hurt the people I don't like and give me stuff and,
You're right. There's a really great keyboard metaphor I heard recently that is great to share, dude. You'll probably like this, is that you don't want to be, not to downgrade this conversation into a political discussion, but you don't want to be control left. That's not a logical path, an extremist version of that. Nor do you want to be alt-right, which is, an extremist version of another ridiculous path. You want to be escape center, right? Because there's a famous quote that says the opposite of something horrible is also horrible. So the best way to kind of get out of any sort of polarization, be that in politics or whatever your perspective on something, is to really not be at the whim of other people's sources in any way, that you kind of turn off information that's not benefiting to you. It's just high noise. That then, if all you do is look to outside sources in any way, whatever the sources may be, it doesn't allow you to create yourself, right? As this podcast is called Radiant Creators, it's like, how do you shut off your noise and go to that kind of cabin in the woods or have this place where you can be in balance with nature and then allow your inner self to create things that are within you, that you're passionate about, that then will outwardly manifest in your works, right? And it will be very obvious through what you've created, even if it's something small, even if it's like your cross stitch that you do, after your daughter goes to sleep at night or your son, or your the cooking that you take pride in the kitchen, stuff like that. It doesn't have to be these massively famous things. And a lot of our own spiritual practice is not something that ever needs to be seen by anyone. We know that so much of what is claimed to be spiritual is just really people trying to sell you stuff. It really is all about what for you works in terms of what you create that is fulfilling to you. And I always find that as somebody that is taken a fair amount of drugs, almost all of which have been wonderful, that my best drug ever is what I create, right? The creative projects has such an enriching and fulfilling nature to it that it's almost like the most rewarding thing of all is to create something that is for you and hopefully others benefit from as well. So if you can do that on multiple fronts and you are able to structure life so that you have time to do that, that's great. That's fantastic. And even if you don't have that much time, but you can still make little side projects here and there, side little hobbies that are your creative passions, that's great too. And if you work hard enough at that over a long period of time, because it takes a long time, it's very rare that this happens overnight. There might even be little revenue streams from those things too. So it ends up being something where you can fully shift all your time to them if you're lucky enough and work hard enough.
That revenue stream and that yellow brick road and following your passion, really, it can start. And even after it has started, it continues with the simple act of perfectly cubing your sweet potatoes in the kitchen.
Yeah, totally.
It's like, I'm getting these perfectly cubed. I'm not attached to the perfection.
This is something that I've noticed is very feminine too, is that a lot of women that are very in tune with themselves and quite far in their own philosophical development take great pride in their processes, whether or not it's making a cup of matcha tea or how they put on their clothes or how they write in their journal. You see this very ornate, intricate detail in things, very Japanese, of especially women that do that. And guys can learn a thing or two as they have piles of Kleenex in their car and, junk in certain places. That kind of cleanliness ties in a lot more too with the clean house, clean mind Zen aesthetic. It's like Zen mind so that it's empty and clear for good stuff to come in, for transmission to arrive.
Oh, exactly. The creative pursuit that interests us is not necessarily grand. That's the thing that people don't always get. And it doesn't have to be something that would mean a thing to anyone else. I mean, it could very well be in the moment you notice, wow, all my doormats are kind of ratty looking. I should go and get new ones. But
totally,
really, it's that simple. And people think, oh, no, but it has to be grand. It's like, no, it really doesn't.
Yeah, there's a statement that, I don't know, I think it was Dion Fortune, the famous occultist, said that you shouldn't even want to live in a mansion in Yorkshire. She was British, so she used these British metaphors. You should want to live in a cottage, a well-kept cottage, right? So I think about like the well-kept cottage in rural England somewhere, right? Where you have a happy home that's well-kept and everything that you do in that home you take pride in. And then once you have the kind of pride, well-kept Zen space, then you have created essentially a pad for you to launch from, right? It's like your Starship launch pad. So if everything's a mess in your life, in terms of like, what our dear friend and my colleague would say, like your home, your work, and your fellowship, if all that stuff's just a mess, it's like you're not going to go anywhere. So again, we all have our bags of crap that we struggle with, and nobody's life is perfect. But to really balance out stuff nicely in terms of your friendships and your relationships and your work, I mean, if you can get some of those things calibrated well and your house is in a good state, it's hugely beneficial for your creative processes. I mean, that is just infinitely valuable. And I find that if I'm struggling or something and I want to write something and it's just writer's block, I'll clean the house or something, and it'll be you take a hike in nature, like you eloquently said, dude, and then you clean the house and you kind of have a nice dinner that you prepare in a well-kept way with respect and reverie, and then you sleep on it, and then maybe the next day, the kind of muse comes back to you, right? If day in, day out, it's just drudgery and mess, you're not going to get that higher self talking to you.
I think one thing I learned as a musician is it is okay to also chase inspiration. Like it can be natural, like we just said, like your natural doings of the day, but also, don't feel odd about going looking for it. Like take a walk and say, I'm looking for inspiration. I know it's out here somewhere. You'll find it.
Totally, dude. That's so well said. It's funny. I found that in the cycles, this kind of goes back to maybe our moon cycles in terms of monthly cycles. And of course, obviously women are very tied in with their moon cycles physically. And then as we're all tied into things mentally, it's like you resonate with what you just feel into that day or that week, right? Like it's very difficult to just be on this structured calendar where you got to do the same shit day in, day out. And what's really important is to kind of work in this area where you're in the flow, where your heart feeling into like, what are you into this week? What are you about? What do you want to follow? Whose material are you resonating with at this period in time? And at what stage of your kind of flow are you in based upon what you want to create, right? And it's very difficult. Neil said this as well when he was writing the documentary, is that he said it's very difficult, or it would be very difficult for him to sit down and just write something day in, day out. And the way that we made that was that we very much each worked in these own kind of our own cycles as to how, when I was editing it, what would I do this week? Would I be working on something else, or would I be really focusing on that project? And it's just based upon what you felt that week, right? And the same with his writing. He'd be like, there's some weeks I'm just not into it. It's just not coming. I'm not feeling it. And then other weeks where it's just like the words are just spilling onto the page. And that's how human beings are naturally supposed to operate. They're not supposed to operate in these very day in, day out, again, robotic cycles or robotic routines. They're supposed to do it in this very more non-linear way that is probably something that's more astrology based, I should say, like where there's ebb and flow and rhythm to it.
The contemplation, the walking, the play, the being at peace. It's really, we are, I believe, far too driven in the empire of nothing, basically, like doing our damnedest to achieve nothing. I think I've always thought of that biblical line, but God makes us to lay in green pastures or something like that. And I've always thought, like, well, if you think about it, I think so. I think humans are kind of supposed to be lackadaisical and lazy and playful and contemplative, and that's where those moments of great inspiration come. And it just seems like our society at this time is missing that, profoundly missing that piece, which might be the most important. We're great at working on assembly lines.
Totally. Well, and one thing just to add to that, dude, is that you should absolutely be able to operate in a hippie drum circle, or you should be able to operate in a high-level corporate boardroom, right? And I don't mean you need to be able to work the meeting, but you should be able to resonate in both of those places and have some balance in each, right? So you don't want to just be super lackadaisical, smoking pot under the tree and getting nothing accomplished. That's cool in a lot of ways, but in other ways it's not good. Nor do you want to be purely looking at your spreadsheets and corporate profits and how you can kind of squeeze more profits out of every single graph on the corporate calendar, right? So it's like it's a great way to look at something in terms of productivity and getting things done that you're passionate about, not things that you're not passionate about. And then also having space and time to really chill out and blob out. And sit under the oak tree and just let, the poetry kind of spill out on your own time, not on somebody else's time. So yeah, well said for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's like there is that power to being multifaceted and taking responsibility for everything in your life and ensuring that you're at least good enough at it. Like, I know it's a silly judgment that I have, but when I'm driving and I see AAA out changing somebody's tire, and it's a guy, and I'm like, what the hell's wrong with you?
Oh, sure, right, yes.
I'm like,
yes.
It's like, you are not taking responsibility for your life, man. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Well, that's the World War Z, the book, the zombie book. There's an entire chapter in that book about when the zombie apocalypse comes, people's skill sets flip the inverted of what they are in today's society. So the market trader and the derivatives trader and the high exec becomes essentially useless because they have no practical skills with their hands, and the mechanic or the janitor that knows how to build things becomes extremely valuable, right? So we should also, yes, have some probably technical capabilities and then have some ways that we can work with our hands in traditional ways that are repair capabilities or fix-it capabilities, right? A society where you have tools that are, every guy should have a tool shop and know how to fix things for sure, or gal too, right? It's not just relying on one binary. But yeah, it's a good point where you should be well versed and well rounded in all areas that you're help fuel your passions, right? It's not like all of us can be Leonardo da Vinci and be a physicist and a mathematician and a great artist, but whatever your passion is, there's areas that passion will let you become very multifaceted in numerous ways to achieve the best that you can be in that area of creative pursuit, right? So yeah, as a musician, it's like you got to get good with your hands, and you got to get good with rhythm, and you got to get good at learning how to read music, and it's just there's many boxes that get checked there. So everything's a tool that you can use to kind of expand your own works.
The Bufo toad secretion. How long did that last?
It lasted about. It depends on the dosage that you take. If you take a very high dose, you can be under for as long as 45 minutes, I think. It depends on the person as well, because everybody's different. Everybody's experience is different. If you take a very minor light dose, it can be as brief as just about 5 minutes. I took a very, very small dose, and it was still profoundly, profoundly life-changing. The numerous times I've taken it, at the time of this recording, I've had it probably 4 or 5 times, have all been very brief and sweet and have shown me staggering amount of things in a very short period of time. So it's not like an ibogaine trip or something that takes, 3 full days of horrendous purging, and it's not something you ever want to do in your life again. So having a brief experience has a benefit too. Again, as we talk about being efficient and also being capable of having whatever you can do that kind of gets you there in a period of time, whether or not it's a brief experience like that with a very small kind of microdose, or it's a very small, short daily meditative practice you might have. And even if you meditate for 10 or 15 minutes a day, that's way better than nothing. So even brief things can go a long way for sure.
You mentioned that it was a white light experience. That's interesting. It speaks to me because you see colors and such. If it is, you might say, playing your game, mixing with your energy, but if you mention it's kind of a pure white light substance, that means it is like a real spiritual shotgun.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at things from a vibrational density perspective, I mean, the highest levels of what you might call returning to a source of all things become essentially just a white light based experience. So I just had a chat with John Michael Greer on my podcast, who's quite an amazing author on occultism, and we talked about various levels of 3D 4D density and how we're here in the material plane, which is very much based in polarity, and then when you visualize something, you're essentially on the astral plane, and that's usually visualized as something that's corporeal, and then you get to higher etheric and energetic planes and mental planes, and then ultimately you get to like a spiritual plane, which is very non-corporeal and fractal holographic, and then beyond that fractal holography and this kind of mesh network, you get to these pure white light states, which lead you to essentially what my colleague kind of calls like the event horizon of deep source, which is where you as a spirit and a soul, right? I sometimes think of spirit as a vertical and a soul as a horizontal, where soul travels with us through multiple lifetimes, and you are an infinite and eternal soul, as essentially an infinite fractal of consciousness. But then your spirit can transition through these various planes, which are, it's not like they're stacked plates on top of each other, but they kind of exist everywhere at all times, and you exist in all these places at all times. And it's very important to know that nothing comes from here, right? So everything comes from a spiritual place. So the spiritual is the cause and the material is the effect, right? So when you have some sort of shamanic experience where you essentially dissolve and melt into the white light all of unity, pure consciousness, people that don't have reference points on that or understand that, they're like, what the hell is that? I don't get it. Why would you do that? Blah, blah, blah. It's for healing and expansion, right? And you realize that you are not just this body, that you are so much more, and that you're connecting to not only a higher self, but you're going to places that show you that you are part of that ultimate divine mind. So just like you and I are two branches on the same thing, right? And then ultimately this gets into very high level philosophical discussions of like, we are all one. And most people don't really know what that means, but we are all capable of going back to this place of pure bliss and love that we will return to one day, because that's where we originate from. So these things, when you have these experiences, they're so fulfilling and life-changing, because it just shows that this struggle of this life, this difficulty and this trials and tribulations is just something that you have self-chosen to experience some polarity for a short period of time. And as you are an infinite and eternal soul, you'll go back to these places of pure love, which sounds a little bit like an esoteric version of just saying you're going back to heaven. But, a lot of orthodoxy has these kind of exoteric half-truths in them, right? So as long as you're getting a direct connection to something, that's what I always advocate.
Oh, definitely. And that makes me think of Neville that you wrote about,
Totally.
that you did an audio on your site about, Neville said in one of his lectures, and I'll put it in the show notes, the specific one, only what comes from heaven can return to heaven. So it's like the fact that you're here states where you were from, and that you were going back there. So
Yeah, right.
It's like
Beautiful.
it's like you can only be here if you're from heaven, and what is from heaven can return to heaven. So it's that you are the white light and you return to it. But just being pure blissed out white light gets kind of boring. So you come here and you bump around for a while.
Yeah, and we only learn, this is a common conversation I'll have too, is that we really only learn from dark sides of shadow polarity. So, from a standpoint of like empire or suppression or difficulty or people's life struggles, it's like you do either win or you learn. And I know that's way easier to say than to experience, because a lot of people go through a lot of hardships in life. But you could almost say that as you do end up being on a yellow brick road, you end up seeing the enchantment and the mystery of life, and you see the synchronicities, and you also end up realizing that so much of what was negative in your life was really truly a gift to show you something about a learning experience, right?
Oh, definitely. As Stuart Wilde, a great esoteric individual, as he put it, there comes a point where you honestly go, thank God for all these assholes. Because they really taught me how full of shit I am. They really helped me along.
Totally, dude. And I have a friend that is in a country, I won't even say what the country is, but it's a nice country, a good country. It's got a lot of great things going for it. It has very good social services, which are, of course, under attack. But the downside of that is that people are very comfortable there, which is nice. But the downside of it is that a lot of people there are very kind of quote unquote asleep, right? Because they've had it so comfortably. So then you look at areas of the planet that has a lot of strife, and that sucks. And that's not necessarily, there's nothing like being some sort of kid in some open air concentration camp, and to be in that person's shoes must be horrid. But at the same time, it takes a lot of those incredible life struggles to realize, to wake up people, right? To really like wake up and see what's going on and what is really behind the veil, and how the kind of circuit board is really structured. So it takes people out of their comfort zone to really move into better self, because the only way that you really grow is through the dark sides of things. So those difficult experiences are definitely there for a reason, for sure.
I was always very thankful when I was a youngster, and I do not endorse these things now, people, so just so you know. Like, I joined the military when I was a kid. I was really, really lucky. I went to go around the world and see the most worst shitholes on this planet, and I realized that it was never about being in the military. That had nothing to do with it. My soul's path, I needed to go see these things because that was essential. It's like I got to see Somalia, which basically, we think about a lot of, preppers in our country and such have the fantasy of, oh man, if shit hits the fan, I can't wait. They're all kind of hoping for it. Having lived there for months, I can tell you what happens. And it's kind of like being a street photographer. I saw in the midst of hell the sweetness of life. So it's really fun. It's like I think to myself, man, if I had a GoPro back then, I could have made a badass documentary.
Yeah, and you also see how some people are so, even in situations of hardship and very poor nations, some people are doing things that are excellent, right? You see that as well. So it's hard to speak in total binaries about everybody from some certain country is, in this complete capsulization of rubbish or bad. It's like everywhere has got good people and bad people, and you can kind of see how things went astray through looking at negative parts of history, and learn from hopefully those mistakes and be appreciative for what you have in an area that hopefully is working out a little better. Even though all countries have their own FUBAR everything, you can see what countries are doing things well in certain ways and what other countries are doing things better in other ways, and hopefully get some perspective on that. So it's nice you had such profound life travels that showed you, I'm sure, some of the horrors of life and then some of the amazingness of life. As we wind this down, I mean, just to have a conversation where we're lucky enough to talk about your creative ventures and walking the yellow brick road and finding your true will and your creative path. I mean, those are things that are relatively high in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So many people are in base subsistence struggle, and we could have a separate, massive conversation about why that's happening and all the real behind the scenes dynamic of that and the higher spiritual references on that and reasons behind that. But just to be in an area or a space and a time in the dynamic where we are, where we can talk about more creative things and hopefully even pursue creative paths, you're in a pretty lucky place, and that's never to be underappreciated or undervalued. So I do think about that sometimes too, dude. It's like even somebody that's been able to make projects that I've made that are independent things, it's just like that's a huge, huge gift and an amazing ability, because so many people don't even have the basic necessities to get out of that, or at least they think they don't, or at least their community have structured things so poorly that they've made it really difficult for themselves. But whole separate other conversation. But just to be able to have that ability to pursue things creatively is a wonderful thing, for sure.
Definitely. And you know, the more you see of the world and the reality of humanity in many situations, it for me creates an urgency. You may only have 70 years, like, or 80 or 90, you never know, like tomorrow's not guaranteed. So this might be it. So do something today, follow your passions.
Absolutely. Yeah, follow your bliss.
Your most recent documentary is Transmutation, that you did with Neil Kramer, and it's quite an amazing body of work. If you could just speak to what you created there for a moment, and then also let us know where we can find Niles Heckman.
Yeah, I can be found at nilesheckman.com, which kind of aggregates to the various projects. I've made a feature documentary film called Transmutation, which is about the beauty and danger of a hidden spiritual path, and kind of highlights those who have transformed themselves by walking it, some of which has been very much kind of touched on in this conversation. I create essentially longer form documentary projects and then shorter form documentary narrations, which I narrate. I have kind of large brushstroke, which I said, and projects, and small brushstroke projects. And then as I talk on my own podcast or other podcasts such as this one, it shares very similar themes of these subjects that resonate with people like you and me, dude. So it's nice to create works that kind of are pieces of media that you can put out there and show something that hopefully is something that people resonate with. And of course, I find all my work to be very paradigm destroyingly awesome and somewhat contentious. So it's very much not like anything that you would find unless you really had to, be exposed to it at the right place at the right time, which is a good thing, right? And so the two projects I've had, these main two projects that we've discussed on this conversation, I think encapsulate that. But you can find everything else I've done at nilesheckman.com, which includes my podcast, An Infinite Path, which is a series of spoken word essays and conversations. And then, my other work there. So yeah, it's been great. It's been great, Craig, like chatting with you. This has been really fun. It's been nice to formally have such a nice conversation, and congrats on doing a podcast where you create nice longer form media. I sometimes talk about how so many people do these kind of memes and short form things. It's really valuable to do longer form media. So I don't do memes myself because of that.
As you create, you find your fellowship, and that's a lot about what we're doing here with Radiant Creators, is interviewing inspiring people to inspire others so that they create, so that they find their fellowship. And this is the fellowship. We're all in the Nebuchadnezzar together hanging out. Thanks so much for your time, Niles. It has been amazing.
My pleasure, man. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Radiant Creators. Check out more content at radiantcreators.com. If you like the show, give it a like. Share this. Comment. Keep the conversation going. You can also find us at alternatecurrentradio.com, where there's this show and a lot more.